The moment my wife stepped out of the car with her duffel bag over her shoulder, the entire cul-de-sac seemed to freeze. Curtains twitched. Porch lights flicked on. And at the center of it all stood her, the HOA president, Karen Montgomery, staring with narrowed suspicion like my wife had arrived to invade the neighborhood instead of simply move into her new home. Within minutes, Karen was on her phone whispering dramatically, pacing circles in her yard. By the time my wife carried her second bag inside, police lights were already painting the street blue and red. But everything changed the moment the officer asked for ID. And Karen saw the card that would expose her mistake, her prejudice, and the secret fear she tried so hard to hide. Before we continue, remember, in neighborhoods ruled by power and control, justice always shows up when you least expect it. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss stories where karma finally gets the spotlight it deserves. The neighborhood looked peaceful that morning, wrapped in the gentle quiet that comes before the day fully wakes. Sunlight filtered through oak branches, dropping warm patches over our driveway as I waited for my wife's car to appear around the bend. She had been deployed for nearly 8 months, and finally, the house we had planned together, the place we hoped to build something stable after years of constant movement, was about to become ours. But peace in a neighborhood like this was fragile. It only took one person to disturb it, and unfortunately, that person held a title, HOA President. Karen Montgomery enjoyed inspecting lawns more than living life, and she treated every newcomer like a threat until proven otherwise. I had learned that the hard way. In the 3 months since moving in, she had questioned my mailbox height, my trash can placement, even the length of time my garage door remained open. But she had behaved herself for the last few weeks, probably because I never reacted. Karen thrived on reactions. When my wife's car finally appeared, sunlight bounced off the hood and the moment felt surreal. The car rolled to a stop, and she stepped out wearing simple jeans and a t-shirt, her hair pulled back the same way she wore it while deployed. She looked tired, stronger, and somehow even more beautiful than the day she left. She lifted her duffel bag with practiced ease, the kind of movement that spoke of years in uniform, of long days and harder nights spent far from anything comforting. But someone else was watching. From the moment she stepped out, Karen had planted herself at the edge of her lawn, arms folded, eyes sharp with suspicion. She eyed the duffel bag like it was contraband. She eyed my wife like she didn't belong here. The neighborhood was quiet in that unnatural way where you can feel people observing without being seen. A couple of blinds shifted from across the street. A sprinkler turned off early nearby. Even a jogger slowed down, unsure whether to keep going or watch whatever conflict was brewing. My wife lifted her second bag, and that was all it took. Karen spun around sharply, walking toward her porch while clicking her phone awake. Her voice was low, rushed, dramatic, the kind of tone she used for HOA emergencies like illegal garden gnomes, or someone's fence is half an inch too tall. Only this time, the urgency felt sharper. Something inside me tightened. I stepped closer to my wife, who didn't notice any of the unfolding tension yet. She was too busy looking at the house, taking in the small porch we had painted together earlier in the summer, the quiet corners we planned to fill with plants, the new life she hoped to settle into after months of chaos. Then the first siren echoed faintly down the main road. Quiet at first, distant enough to question. Then louder. Closer. The jogger stopped completely. A dog barked somewhere behind a fence. Karen stood frozen near her mailbox, eyes bright with smug satisfaction. Blue and red lights washed over the neighborhood as a patrol car turned onto our street. My wife finally looked up, confusion knitting her expression as she lowered her bag. The car slowed, rolled to a gentle stop near our driveway, and for a moment the entire world went still. The officer stepped out with calm, cautious movements. He wasn't aggressive, not even tense, more curious than anything else. But behind him, Karen approached rapidly, pointing toward us with sharp gestures, already shaping her version of the story in her mind. The officer approached. His gaze moved between me, the house, and my wife. There was a softness in his stance, a professionalism that contrasted sharply with Karen's frantic energy. He asked my wife for identification, standard procedure, nothing hostile, just information gathering. My wife reached into her wallet without hesitation. She held out her ID with the same steady hand she used while deployed, a calmness born from survival and training rather than confidence. The officer leaned forward to examine it. Then something shifted, not in the officer, but in Karen. Her confident posture cracked. Her brows lifted. Her mouth parted slightly. The color drained from her face as she realized exactly what kind of ID she was looking at. The bold lettering. The official seals. The unmistakable designation of someone who had earned respect through sacrifice, not someone who should ever be treated as a suspicious outsider. In that moment, Karen's entire narrative collapsed. The officer straightened, offering a slow nod, a visible sign of respect. But Karen stepped back, her earlier confidence evaporating into panic. She clutched her phone tighter, her breathing shallow, her expression flickering between embarrassment and fear. She looked not at us, but back toward her own house, as if she suddenly wanted to disappear inside it. The neighbors watching from behind their blinds leaned in closer. The jogger resumed movement but slower, pretending not to observe while clearly absorbing every detail. My wife finally caught on to the emotional atmosphere around her. She turned slightly, sensing the tension, the unspoken shift in power. And though she didn't say a single word, the calm, unwavering strength in her presence was enough to send another wave of discomfort through Karen. But the moment wasn't over. The officer looked toward Karen with a quiet question in his expression, one that asked why she had called in the first place. And as the silence hung in the air, Karen stumbled over her explanation, struggling to justify herself. The mood shifted again, thicker, heavier, poised on the edge of something that would soon unravel the entire HOA. And that unraveling was about to begin. The air around us seemed to thicken as the officer waited for Karen to speak. It wasn't a demanding silence, but a patient one, the kind that leaves nowhere to hide. Karen had always been quick with explanations, quick with rules, quick with accusations, yet now she seemed to struggle for even the simplest justification. Her fingers twitched nervously around her phone, and her lips parted as if she were about to speak, but no words actually formed. The ID had changed everything. It wasn't just the authority it represented, it was what it revealed about my wife. Her sacrifice, her discipline, her service. All the assumptions Karen had made evaporated the moment she realized the person she had reported wasn't a trespasser or a threat, but someone who had served the country she claimed to fiercely protect through HOA regulations and neighborhood protocols. The neighbors continued watching, their blinds half open. The tension had grown thick enough to pull the entire street into its gravity. The police car's lights slowed, casting softer pulses of red and blue across the pavement, like the heartbeat of the unfolding drama. Finally, Karen forced out a shaky explanation. She spoke quickly, too quickly, trying to reshape her motivations into something logical. She gestured toward my wife's bags, the unfamiliar car, the early morning arrival. She tried to cast herself as vigilant rather than paranoid, as concerned rather than controlling. But her words lacked the confidence she usually wielded. Each sentence stumbled into the next. Each claim felt weaker than the last. The officer listened carefully, but his eyes showed no alarm, only a polite patience. When Karen finished, he nodded slowly, then shifted his attention back to my wife. The neighbors leaned closer, as if the direction of his attention alone determined who held the moral high ground. My wife stood calmly, unaffected by the chaos around her. There was something in her posture, a quiet assurance, a steadiness that didn't need defending, that made the entire situation feel surreal. She had endured harsher environments than anything this pristine neighborhood could muster. Her presence alone seemed to expose the triviality of Karen's panic. The officer thanked her, handed back the ID, and apologized for the inconvenience. That simple gesture, a nod of respect, made Karen's shoulders tighten. She took a step back, clutching her cardigan like a shield. The officer turned briefly toward her, not with accusation but with expectation, silently urging her to reflect on her actions. But reflection was not something Karen excelled at. Her gaze darted around the neighborhood, searching for allies, but the same neighbors who usually praised her for keeping the community in order now avoided eye contact. They didn't want to be connected to the situation. They didn't want to be seen supporting someone who had misjudged the wrong person. My wife lifted her bag again, calmly walking toward the house. The officer stepped aside respectfully, and the moment she passed him, the final traces of confidence slipped from Karen's posture. She seemed smaller, not physically, but in presence, as though the authority she clung to as HOA president had cracked in her hands. Once my wife was safely inside, the officer gave a final nod, offered a short explanation about misunderstanding calls, and returned to his vehicle. The flashing lights dimmed as he drove away, leaving only the soft hum of engines fading into the distance. The silence that followed was heavier than before, not tense, but contemplative. Karen stood frozen for a moment, staring at the empty street where the patrol car had been. Reality settled over her like a weight she couldn't shake off. She turned slowly, her face pale, and made her way back toward her house. But it wasn't the brisk, self-assured march she usually displayed. Her steps were hesitant, uneven, like the ground beneath her wasn't stable anymore. I watched as she crossed her yard. Even the wind seemed to hush around her. She paused near her hydrangeas, the same one she fined a neighbor over for being the wrong shade of blue, and pressed a hand to her forehead. It was the first time I had ever seen her look uncertain. Inside the house, my wife placed her bags down gently and exhaled deeply. The home we dreamt of building together felt suddenly wrapped in a strange mix of comfort and confrontation. She wasn't frightened, but she was alert. Her training had taught her to recognize hostility in its earliest forms, and she understood instantly that Karen would not let today go without consequences. And she was right. Karen didn't remain inside her house for long. Within minutes, she emerged again, this time holding a clipboard, her symbol of authority. She marched from yard to yard, knocking on doors, speaking rapidly to anyone who opened. Her composure had returned slightly, but it was fueled not by confidence, but by desperation. She needed to recover her image. She needed her sense of control back. The neighbors listened politely but didn't echo her urgency. Instead, they glanced toward our house, their faces a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Something unspoken passed between them, a shared understanding that Karen had crossed a line she couldn't redraw. By late afternoon, the HOA group chat lit up with messages. Notifications buzzed in houses across the street. Some were sympathetic. Some were shocked. Some simply asked for clarification. But the tone was shifting, and Karen could feel it slipping. Each message she sent trying to justify her actions was met with hedged responses, neutral reactions, or silence. As the sun began to set, streaking the sky with warm orange and cool purple, the neighborhood seemed to exhale. But beneath the calm surface ran a quiet current of unease. Karen's authority had been shaken, and she knew it. My wife stepped onto the porch then, taking in the scene with steady eyes. She didn't need words to articulate what she sensed, the first tremors of a larger conflict beginning to unfold. And somewhere across the street, behind partially drawn blinds, Karen watched her. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes held something sharp, a mixture of fear, resentment, and something far more dangerous, a determination to regain control. The real battle was only beginning, and it was about to get personal. The night settled over the neighborhood with an uneasy quiet, the kind that doesn't soothe but lingers with questions left unanswered. Porch lights flickered on one by one, washing the sidewalks in soft amber glows, but beneath that warm exterior was tension building like a storm. My wife stood on the porch for a long moment, watching the subtle movements across the street. Lights inside Karen's home shifted from window to window, her silhouette pacing, stopping, pacing again. It was clear that she wasn't retreating, she was regrouping. The next morning confirmed it. Before the sun had fully risen, Karen was already out, armed with her clipboard and a renewed sense of mission. The dew was still fresh on the grass as she marched from property to property, the sharp tap of her shoes echoing through the stillness. She was dressed impeccably, as if preparing for a formal inspection rather than simply walking around a quiet suburban street. Her determination was unnerving. She approached every neighbor she could find, speaking with expressions that oscillated between forced concern and crafted authority. Some neighbors nodded politely while others appeared confused, unsure why she seemed so unsettled after last night's events. She gestured toward our house more than once, her movements sharp and impatient. Her story was clearly evolving, shaped to regain the credibility she had lost. Inside our home, the morning routine felt different. My wife moved with quiet intention, unpacking her belongings one room at a time. Her boots were placed by the door with deliberate precision, her uniforms hung neatly inside the closet, and the medal she carried, quiet reminders of her service, remained wrapped carefully in soft fabric. With every item she placed, The house felt more complete, more anchored, more ours. But with each passing hour, Karen's restlessness seemed to grow. She circled our house twice by noon, pretending to check on sidewalk cracks or shrub measurements, though her glances toward the windows made her real focus unmistakable. She was watching for something, anything that she could twist into a violation. A pretext. A justification. By mid-afternoon, a notice appeared on our mailbox. The paper was crisp, the ink freshly printed, the language formal yet accusatory. The claims were vague, potential non-compliance concerns regarding unregistered vehicles and unauthorized occupants. It was the kind of notice designed to alert the HOA board and compel immediate action, even if the reasoning behind it was baseless. My wife read it silently, her expression calm but thoughtful. The accusation didn't frustrate her, it concerned her. She had seen this kind of pattern before, not in neighborhoods but in authority structures where insecurity turned into petty rule enforcement. She recognized the intention behind the tactics. They weren't about community standards. They were about control. The neighbors began noticing the shift too. A few approached us politely in passing, asking if everything was all right. Their curiosity was laced with genuine concern. They had witnessed enough of Karen's behavior to understand that something larger was brewing beneath the surface. Some hinted that this wasn't the first time she had behaved this way, though never with stakes as high as this. Never with someone who didn't fold under the weight of her authority. As early evening arrived, Karen held an impromptu meeting in her driveway, gathering the HOA board members around her like a council of advisors. She spoke animatedly, pointing toward our house multiple times. Her voice carried just far enough for fragments to drift across the street, mentions of neighborhood safety, protocol breaches, and unexpected arrivals. It was clear she was trying to rewrite the narrative, trying to cast herself as the vigilant protector rather than the one who had made a disastrous judgment the previous day. But there was something new in her tone, a desperation barely hidden beneath her formal language. The board members exchanged uncertain glances, their expressions indicating they weren't sure they wanted to endorse her crusade this time. Yet Karen's grip on the community had always come from persistence, not logic. She pushed harder with each nod she failed to secure. As darkness began to creep into the edges of the street, the atmosphere shifted again. My wife stepped outside for a moment to breathe the cool evening air, unaware that Karen was watching from her window. The porch light illuminated her face gently, highlighting the quiet strength that Karen had misinterpreted from the start. That calm presence seemed to unsettle Karen more than anything else. Soon, another notice appeared. This one slipped into our door frame. The paper contained a list of pending violations, each more ridiculous than the last. Overgrown grass by an inch. A supposed noise disturbance dated on a day we weren't even home. A potential guest authorization issue referring to my wife, who didn't need authorization to live in her own home. It wasn't subtle anymore. It wasn't even strategic. It was retaliation. My wife studied the notice without flinching. Her breathing remained steady, her posture grounded. She didn't crumble under pressure, she evaluated it. She had faced commanders, missions, and training far more intense than a neighborhood power struggle. But she also understood something essential, that allowing unjust misuse of authority to grow silently was the root of larger issues. And she wasn't about to let that happen here. The next morning, she left early, her steps calm yet purposeful. She returned with a folder clasped under her arm, organized, labeled, precise. She placed it gently on our kitchen counter, then stepped aside. The seal on the cover made one thing clear. She wasn't approaching this as a frustrated homeowner. She was approaching it as a trained professional who understood procedure, structure, and accountability far better than the HOA president ever could. That evening, as the sun melted into shades of amber and coral, we heard the soft thump of a letter landing against our door. Karen had struck again, another notice, another claim, another attempt to re-establish her lost authority. But this time, when we opened the door, she was standing on the sidewalk, watching us with a look that carried a strange mix of triumph and trepidation. She didn't seem entirely confident in her actions, but she held her clipboard tightly, as if gripping it harder could restore the power she felt slipping through her fingers. The moment felt like the calm before a deeper confrontation. The tension didn't rise loudly, it settled heavily, like fog gathering over still ground. Karen had made her move. But she didn't realize the response was already in motion. And when it came, it would shake the foundation of the HOA more than she imagined. The following morning felt different, not just for us, but for the entire neighborhood. A kind of charged stillness hung in the air, the type that forms on the edge of a shift no one fully understands yet. Birds chirped in short, uneven bursts, as if unsettled by the tension spreading through the cul-de-sac. Even the breeze felt cautious, brushing lightly against shutters and porch railings as though trying not to disturb something fragile. My wife stood in the living room, quiet and composed, reviewing the documents she had gathered. The folder she brought home the day before sat open across the kitchen counter. Everything inside was organized with a precision that years of service had taught her. She wasn't preparing for a confrontation out of anger. She was preparing because it was the right thing to do, because a misuse of authority, even on a small scale, wasn't something she could overlook. Outside, Karen's behavior had grown increasingly restless. She had stepped outside twice already, pacing along her front walkway, peering toward our home like she expected trouble, or perhaps feared it. Each time a car drove past, she turned abruptly, checking to see if it was someone coming to question her. And although she tried to appear unbothered, the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. By midday, the first decisive step came. My wife walked toward the HOA office, a small building near the community park that had rarely been used for anything more than collecting dues and storing old binders. As she approached, parents walking their children home from school paused to observe. Some offered polite nods, their gazes curious. Others whispered among themselves, already sensing that a reckoning was coming. Inside the office, the HOA board members were gathered around a table cluttered with loose papers and coffee mugs. Their expressions shifted the moment my wife entered. Some straightened in their seats. Others exchanged subtle glances, half curiosity, half apprehension. They knew what had happened with the police. They knew about Karen's escalating notices. And they knew this wasn't just a complaint, this was someone taking a stand. My wife placed the folder on the table with deliberate calmness. She explained the events in a steady, measured tone, outlining the timeline from the moment she arrived to the morning's unjust violation notice. There was no anger in her voice, just clarity, facts, and a sense of responsibility. She described the unnecessary distress caused by the police call, the discriminatory assumptions behind it, and the retaliatory pattern that had unfolded since. The board members listened with growing discomfort. Some shifted in their chairs. Others stared down at the table, as if realizing they had overlooked Karen's behavior for far too long. The weight of the situation pressed heavily against the walls of the small office. Meanwhile, across the street, Karen watched through her living room window. She had seen my wife leave earlier and had been pacing ever since. She checked her phone repeatedly, hoping for updates from the board members. But the silence from them was telling. She was losing her grip. As hours passed, the atmosphere in the neighborhood grew tense. Word traveled quickly. By early evening, neighbors began stepping outside with small gestures of concern, watering their lawns longer than usual, adjusting decorations on their porches, lingering by mailboxes. The street felt like a stage where everyone knew a confrontation was underway, and no one wanted to miss the unfolding drama. As dusk settled, my wife returned home with the same calmness she'd left with. But there was a new gravity in her demeanor, a quiet resolve that hinted at what she had accomplished. She placed the closed folder on the kitchen table and sat beside it, exhaling slowly. Her silence wasn't uncertainty. It was reflection. Across the street, Karen finally received a call. She answered immediately, her expression tightening as she listened. The conversation was short, but the effect was unmistakable. Her face drained of color. She gripped the phone tightly. Then she lowered it slowly and stared at her clipboard, her symbol of authority, like she no longer recognized it. The board had asked her to step down temporarily while they reviewed the complaints. The news spread fast. Neighbors whispered from yard to yard. Some expressed relief. Others were stunned. Everyone had expected tension, but no one had expected such a direct challenge to Karen's authority. She had ruled the HOA for years, wielding rules and fines like tools of superiority. But now, her position was slipping away. The next morning, the impact grew clearer. Karen was no longer pacing outside, no longer inspecting lawns, no longer calling meetings. Her blinds remained closed. Her car stayed parked. Even her hydrangeas, her pride, went untouched despite a fallen branch lying beside them. The absence of her presence felt almost louder than her usual constant vigilance. But the situation was far from over. Retaliation often doesn't end when authority is removed. It can grow more unpredictable. Late in the afternoon, a neighbor knocked gently on our door. The knock wasn't urgent, but it carried concern. She held a small envelope, her hands trembling slightly. She explained that she had found it tucked under her doormat. An unmarked letter, slipped quietly during the early morning hours. Inside was a printed message filled with complaints about us. Fabricated, exaggerated, desperate attempts to sway the neighborhood's trust. We opened it and read the contents silently. The wording was unmistakably Karen's. Formal, dramatic, dripping with thinly veiled fear disguised as community concern. The neighbor apologized for even bringing it, insisting she didn't believe a word. She simply thought we needed to know. Her expression carried both sympathy and frustration, the kind that grows when someone realizes they've allowed a person like Karen to hold power for too long. One by one, throughout the evening, other neighbors approached quietly with similar letters. Some were slipped in mailboxes. Others were left on porch steps. All echoed the same fabricated story, a last-ditch attempt by Karen to salvage her reputation. But instead of turning against us, the neighborhood began to shift. Neighbors who had once stayed silent suddenly stepped forward with their own experiences, their own frustrations, their own stories of being targeted by her unnecessary rules. Each story added weight to the truth, building a collective understanding. By nightfall, a calm settled across the street. But underneath it was a new tension, no longer directed at us, but at Karen. She had pushed too far. And the community she once controlled was beginning to unravel the very structure she built. But consequences rarely end at exposure. They deepen. And tomorrow, they would reach her doorstep in a way she never expected. Morning arrived with a strange heaviness, the kind that settles across a neighborhood right before something breaks. The sun rose slowly over the rooftops, casting long, cold shadows that stretched across the lawns like reminders of everything left unspoken. For the first time since moving in, the street felt uncertain, not because of us, but because the person who once controlled it had lost her grip. My wife stood by the window, steady and silent, watching as neighbors walked their dogs or retrieved their morning papers. Their movements were slower than usual, their glances drifting toward Karen's house with caution. Her blinds remained tightly shut, creating a stark contrast to the rest of the waking community. Even the house itself looked tense, as if holding its breath. The official HOA review had begun at sunrise. Board members had gathered early, quietly slipping into a neighbor's garage that had been offered as a neutral meeting spot. They carried binders, tablets, and folders filled with years of documents, records that now served as a mirror reflecting a long history of overreach. For the first time, they were willing to examine the pattern they had ignored for so long. Inside Karen's home, there was no sign of movement, no pacing, no inspecting, no checking yards for imaginary violations. The silence from her house was loud enough to unsettle the entire cul-de-sac. Around mid-morning, an email from the HOA arrived in every resident's inbox. The subject line was simple but heavy with implication: Community Review Notice. In it, the board explained that they were investigating a formal complaint regarding misuse of authority, discriminatory behavior, and retaliatory actions by the HOA president. They asked residents to come forward with any relevant experiences. Within hours, submissions poured in. Stories Karen had hoped everyone had forgotten resurfaced like ghosts awakened. Stories of fines issued without warning, threats of rule enforcement for trivial matters, and targeted harassment disguised as safety concerns. People who had once been too intimidated to speak now shared everything they had endured. It was no longer just about us. It was about years of unchecked control. My wife read the email calmly, her expression unchanging. She wasn't satisfied or vindicated, just resolute. She had confronted the behavior not out of personal anger but because it was wrong. Seeing the community finally acknowledge it added weight to the truth that should have been obvious from the start. By early afternoon, the first crack in Karen's composure finally showed. Her front door opened just slightly, the smallest sliver of light spilling onto her porch. She peeked out, her eyes darting across the street. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes mismatched, a stark contrast to her usual flawless presentation. She looked not like a leader, but like a person realizing her house of authority was collapsing. She stepped outside briefly, clutching her clipboard with trembling hands. But instead of marching with purpose, she turned back inside quickly, as if afraid the street itself would confront her. It didn't take long. A board member walked across the road, holding several printed statements collected from residents. He knocked on her door gently at first, then more firmly. Karen didn't answer, but everyone knew she was inside. Curtains moved. Shadows shifted. The knock echoed down the quiet street, a soft but definitive signal that things had changed. Later in the afternoon, another wave of emails arrived, this time confirming that Karen's role had been formally suspended pending a full hearing. The language was deliberate, careful, and unmistakable. She was no longer permitted to issue notices, conduct inspections, or represent the HOA in any capacity. The clipboard she clung to so desperately had lost its power. The neighborhood felt the shift immediately. Children played freely on the sidewalks without her stern stares. Neighbors lingered in conversation without fear of her sudden interruptions. Even the air felt lighter, as though the community itself was exhaling for the first time in years. But the real breaking point came at sunset. The board held an emergency neighborhood meeting at the gazebo in the small park down the street. The orange glow of the setting sun reflected off the wooden beams as residents gathered in slow, steady streams. The air buzzed with whispers, uncertainty, and relief. My wife and I stood toward the back, silent observers. She didn't need to speak. Her presence alone had reshaped the direction of the entire conversation. The board addressed the group openly for the first time in years. They admitted they had overlooked concerns. They acknowledged that fear of confrontation had led them to allow behavior that didn't represent the community's values. They apologized, not with empty words, but with a clear commitment to rebuilding trust. And then they announced something no one expected. The HOA bylaws would undergo a complete review, and residents would vote on structural changes, including limiting presidential authority and requiring transparency on all enforcement actions. A ripple of astonishment washed through the crowd. This wasn't just a correction. It was a transformation. As the meeting ended, neighbors approached us quietly, not out of sympathy, but gratitude. They thanked my wife not for her military service, but for standing up when others couldn't. They spoke with sincerity, offering support, respect, and a new sense of unity. But beneath the calm surface lay one final moment no one anticipated. When we returned home, a small envelope sat on our doormat. Unlike the earlier anonymous letters, this one had shaky handwriting on the front. My name. Nothing more. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No accusations, no fabricated claims. Just a short, uneven message that revealed everything. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know who you were. I'm sorry for what I started. I never meant for it to go this far. Signed only, Karen. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't closure. But it was the first honest thing she had written in a very long time. And yet, the apology didn't erase the consequences that were still unfolding. Because the next morning, the board would arrive at her door with the final decision. And that decision would change everything. The morning of the final decision arrived quietly, but the stillness carried weight. Even before the sun fully rose, the neighborhood had an unusual awareness to it, like everyone sensed that the story that had shaken their peaceful cul-de-sac was about to end. Not with shouting, not with confrontation, but with the kind of irreversible shift that can only happen when truth finally takes its rightful place. My wife stood by the kitchen window, sipping her coffee with steady calm. Her posture remained composed, unwavering, the same way it had been through every step of the ordeal. She wasn't waiting with anticipation or nerves. She was simply observing, grounded in the understanding that accountability must be followed through, not out of vengeance, but out of responsibility. Across the street, Karen's house sat in the early dawn light like a monument of denial. The blinds were still drawn, the porch untouched, the lawn uninspected. Even the hydrangeas she once obsessed over seemed forgotten. Her silence had lingered for 2 days, and though the neighborhood tried to continue as usual, everyone's attention drifted toward the house that had once set the tone for the entire community. It was just after 8 when the board members began to arrive. Their cars pulled in quietly, parking along the curb. They weren't dressed for hostility. They wore the expressions of individuals who had finally accepted their duty. Clipboards, folders, sealed envelopes, tools not of power, but of accountability, rested in their hands as they gathered on the sidewalk. Neighbors peeked through blinds or stepped onto porches under the guise of retrieving morning papers. Conversations died down when the board formed a small circle, reviewing the final documents. A soft murmur rolled through the neighborhood like a breeze. Today is the day. Moments later, the board approached Karen's door. The slow, deliberate knock echoed down the street. This time, there was no uncertainty, no hesitation. The knock wasn't confrontational. It was procedural, neutral and definitive. Inside the house, movement stirred. Curtains shifted ever so slightly. A silhouette passed behind the blinds, pausing as if bracing against the moment. When Karen finally opened the door, her posture was fragile. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her shoulders slumped, her usual meticulously crafted appearance replaced with the fatigue of someone who had fought a losing battle with their own pride. The board delivered the decision with measured calm. Words like misconduct, abuse of authority, and breach of trust drifted across the quiet street. The suspension was no longer temporary. She was stripped of her role entirely, barred from holding any HOA position for 5 years, and required to complete a mediation process with the community she had fractured. The bylaws would be rewritten, not only because of her actions, but to prevent this kind of unchecked control from rising again. When the final envelope changed hands, Karen's expression wavered, not in anger, but in something deeper. Something like realization. The weight of consequences settled onto her like a long overdue shadow. She didn't argue. She didn't resist. She simply lowered her gaze, nodding slowly, as if acknowledging a truth she had spent years avoiding. The board dispersed quietly after that. No cheers, no confrontation, just the silent acceptance of a community moving forward. But for the neighborhood, the decision marked a turning point. Neighbors stepped outside more confidently, exchanging greetings that carried relief. Conversations that once held hints of fear now felt open, easy. Children laughed freely in driveways without glancing nervously toward Karen's house. The cul-de-sac breathed again. My wife stepped onto our porch, not to celebrate, but to observe. Her quiet presence alone had become a touchstone of stability for the community. She never sought recognition, yet her resolve had reshaped the way people saw authority, fairness, and courage. Her calm strength had exposed what fear had kept hidden. Throughout the afternoon, neighbors approached her gently, offering gratitude, not in dramatic displays, but in the kind of heartfelt gestures that carry meaning. A homemade casserole left on the porch. A handwritten note tucked beneath a mailbox flag. A small bouquet from the neighbor who once feared Karen's judgment more than she feared speaking truth. Each gesture added a soft layer of healing to a street recovering from years of tension. But the most unexpected moment came just before sunset. Karen stepped outside. She crossed her yard slowly, as if the ground beneath her felt unfamiliar without the authority she once wielded. Her hands were empty. No clipboard, no binder, no phone. Just a quiet vulnerability in her footsteps. She paused at the edge of our driveway, taking in a breath that trembled at the edges. She didn't approach fully, didn't intrude. She simply stood there, facing the woman she had misjudged so deeply. There were no words exchanged. None were needed. The apology she had written earlier lingered between them, incomplete yet sincere. And though my wife didn't offer forgiveness, not because she withheld it, but because she understood it wasn't the moment, it became clear that Karen wasn't seeking redemption. She was seeking acknowledgement of the truth she had finally accepted. With a small nod, she turned and walked back home. Not defeated, but changed. As night settled across the neighborhood, porch lights flickered on one by one, bathing the street in a warm, peaceful glow. For the first time since moving in, the cul-de-sac felt like a place where a future could grow without fear or tension. The house we dreamed of building together finally felt safe, grounded, and whole. Inside, my wife hung her uniform jacket neatly in the hallway closet, a simple gesture, but one that felt symbolic. She had brought her strength home not to fight, but to protect what was right. And in doing so, she had changed the entire neighborhood. This wasn't a story of conflict. It was a story of clarity, of courage, of a community rediscovering itself, and of one woman who reminded them all what integrity truly looks like.